Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is starting a series about Azure ARC. And today's discussion will be an introduction to Azure ARC. So, as we approach this session, Azure ARC is something that I um, didn't start digging into until a couple of months ago, really. And I was at a users group conference and presenting, and then one of the attendees, when it was Q&A time, asked a question. I forget even what the topic was I was talking about, but asked a question why they would need to do what I was talking about with config. I can't remember. It's either Config Manager or Intune when they have Azure Arc, right? And so I scrambled a little bit. I never really had any familiarity with Azure Arc, and so I answered the question. But then I immediately started on a journey to understand what Azure Arc is, and so that's where we arrive at this series now. And this is the introduction. So I struggled a little bit with how to structure this, right? Whether we just jump right into some of the technical pieces or whether we spend some time in an intro. And so this will be a shorter session to kind of intro, but whenever I thought about it myself, I I didn't even know what Azure Arc was, right? And so I want to use this session to build some foundational knowledge, at least about what it is, and then we'll dig into the pieces of it in a broader sense as we go along, right? So this is the introduction, and here is the agenda for it. Simply, what is Azure Arc? Why do we care about Azure Arc? Some scenarios that we will talk about in future sessions with Azure Arc, and then we'll be done. Again, a shorter session today, but an important one to set the stage going forward, right? So what is Azure Arc? Well, at the end of the day, it really is about governance. Having and governance and management really kind of go hand in hand, but governance in terms of we have in Azure all sorts of resources that we could bring to bear to manage our our devices, our workloads, if you will. Uh, there's the ability to have a single pane of glass. There's role-based access control and cloud native practices and security and compliance. All of those are pretty familiar whenever you think about Azure. And if you're in Azure, that's great. You can take advantage of those. But if you're not in Azure, then having a consistent way to govern the devices that you have out there, the workloads, I should say, that you have out there is really, really important. And that at its base is really what Azure Arc is about. So jumping ahead to Azure to non-Azure, that really is what Azure Arc is about. Taking your workloads that might exist in different locations and making them uh, visible in Azure, manageable in Azure, so that you do have that single pane of glass management type experience. So let's back up to management just for a minute. So when we talk about management, what are we talking about? Well, you're going to hear me talk about servers probably a lot in this session. Azure Arc certainly is about managing servers. It's not just about managing servers, but it is about managing servers. And I'll say that a few times in a couple of different ways as we go through this, right? But it's also about managing workloads such as SQL or Kubernetes or VMs, right? And some other things that we'll talk about. Let's talk about servers for just a minute, right? So, whenever I first approached Azure Arc, I started with Azure Arc for servers because, hey, I'm a manageability guy, and that's one of the things that we manage with Config Manager and have familiarity for, right? And so, as I approached Azure Arc and started getting familiar with it, one of the things that struck me is in the Config Manager world, certainly we have lots and lots of customers that are using uh, Config Manager to manage servers. But in reality, Config Manager is not talked about as a server management product. You can certainly do it, right? We don't block that. We do support it. But if you look at what's in Config Manager and being added to Config Manager, the vast majority of it is to benefit uh, workstation management, right? Some of those things certainly benefit servers as well. But it's been a long time since I can think of one thing that has been added specifically for servers, right? So Endpoint Manager, Config Manager is geared toward workstations and not servers, yet you can manage servers with Config Manager. I kind of think about Azure Arc in a similar way, and this is me thinking about it this way. It may not be actually the way we would document it or whatever, but if you look at Azure Arc is focused on servers and server workloads, right? So I just tested it to see if you could install a Windows 10 and 11 device to Azure Arc, and you absolutely can, right? Azure Arc's not intended for workstations. It's intended for servers. And so bear that in mind, right? It is a server and server workload centric thing. So we've already talked about, this diagram where Azure being extended to non-Azure to be able to take those uh, Azure controls and so on and put them on non-Azure things. So when I say non-Azure things, what does that mean? Again, I'll say this a couple of times. Uh, Azure certainly is our cloud service, but there's other cloud services out there where you might have servers running. Could be AWS, could be Google Cloud, could be the widget cloud for that matter. And we are cloud agnostic with Azure Arc. Azure Arc will install uh, or can be used to onboard those servers in third-party cloud solutions and bring them into the fold with Azure so that you have a consistent control plane, right? Ironically, the only cloud that you can't install Azure Arc onto the server workloads managed there is, and there's an asterisk here, but I'll say the servers that are hosted in Azure. I think I said that poorly. Let me say it again. So the only cloud where you might have servers hosted and you cannot include those servers with Azure Arc is Azure, right? And that sounds weird at first, but why? Azure Arc is not about doing anything in Azure. In Azure, we already have those controls. You already have the control plane that you want. Azure Arc is about extending Azure so that you can use that Azure portal, that Azure interface to be able to do the things that you might want to do, right? Okay. And then also, whenever we talk about extending to non-Azure, talked about third-party clouds, it could also be on-prem resources. So you might have VMs on-prem running in VMware, running in Hyper-V, whatever. You might have physical machines out there that you want to extend support to and be able to manage through Azure. Absolutely possible, totally possible, right? The other, pardon me, the other thing that is really interesting here is when we think about managing servers in the config manager world, we think about Windows, right? And that's absolutely true. However, there are a lot of Linux workloads out there. We did support Linux in config manager, I think up until 1810 was the version. But either way, Azure Arc is not just a Windows solution, it is a Linux solution too, right? So that's a really important thing to understand. So staying on the page of what is Azure Arc. So one of the questions that I asked that I found some documentation about that really helped a lot is Azure Arc a replacement for System Center, right? And that's an intentional use of System Center, not just a config manager thing. System Center includes orchestrator, operations manager, and so forth. So is Azure Arc a replacement for System Center? Well, I've got it on the chart here. I won't read it to you, but effectively, there are capabilities here that we have in Azure Arc, and we read out if it is an Azure Arc capability and if it is also a config manager capability. And the short answer to this is no, Azure Arc is not a replacement for System Center. It has some capabilities that are similar uh, or could replace similar capabilities in System Center, but it is not a lock, stock, and barrel shift from System Center. So, for example, one place that Azure Arc is really awesome is that would be also similar in the config manager world is update management, right? It's awesome because update management is a monthly thing that people really probably would prefer not to do. And so Azure Arc enables being able to manage updates in a much simpler way, in a much more automatic way. And if it were me trying to choose between Config Manager or Azure Arc to manage my updates on servers, it would be Azure Arc hands down, right? There are other capabilities that you might want to do, like software distribution. Can Azure Arc do software distribution? The answer is absolutely. But the answer also, or the detail of that answer is that Azure Arc is not as elegant a solution to manage application deployment as something like Config Manager is. Inventory. Can Azure Arc do inventory? Yeah. Is it an equivalent to Config Manager? No, right? And so there's a lot of things to understand about it. And so one of the things that you can arrive at as you think about Azure Arc, do you have to make a decision? Azure Arc or Config Manager, or maybe Azure Arc or System Center? And the answer is you don't have to decide that. You can have Azure Arc running alongside Config Manager, right? Or other System Center products where it makes sense. So pick the tool that's best out of whatever product you're using. I kind of think about this is a poor analogy because really it's not the case here, but I think about co-management for Config Manager and Intune, right? For workstations. And so when you have co-management, you can choose to let Intune manage what Intune is really good at, and you can let Config Manager manage what Config Manager is really good at, right? And then we coordinate between the two. Well, we don't have a co-management kind of capability between Azure Arc and Config Manager for servers, but it's kind of the same concept. If you have both tools available on a server, then you can choose whichever tool makes the most sense to be able to do a certain thing, right? For what that's worth. Another thing about Azure Arc we'll see on the next slide. I talk about SCOM, right? We'll see some things when we dig into the server side that are very monitor-like, right? SCOM-like. Now, it is not a replacement. Azure Arc is not a replacement for SCOM. SCOM is a very robust product that will help monitor all sorts of things on your servers that you would care about, right? But there's a lot of really good detail that comes from Azure Arc. And so we'll see that whenever we get into the server session next, right? But bottom line, Azure Arc is not a lock, stock, and barrel replacement for System Center. It's something to put in the tool belt and understand what the capabilities are and being able to choose the best tool for the job, right? Okay, so why Azure Arc? Why do we care about Azure Arc? Well, consistency is absolutely paramount, right? Having an ability to have your servers or your server workloads consistently managed no matter where they are. Again, in the cloud, in third-party clouds, on-prem, in VMs, on physical servers, it makes no difference. That consistency is really, 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 really cool, right? Um, and again, I keep talking about servers and server workloads just to be specific. There are workloads that we can manage with Azure Arc beyond just servers. So we can manage SQL that's running on servers. We can manage Kubernetes clusters that are running on servers. Again, Windows and Linux, or in third-party clouds, or on-prem in VMs or physical servers. You name it, right? There's a lot of things that we can manage with this. We'll detail that as we progress through the series, right? So when I say servers and server workloads, understand the server workloads includes things like SQL, like Kubernetes, and so on, right? The scope of Azure Arc, that's another reason we care about it. I've already said it, right? The scope is multi-cloud, so third-party clouds absolutely supported, uh, whatever the cloud is, with Azure Arc. Being able to bring multiple data centers together, VMs that are running in your data center on whatever VM platform it is, physical, virtual servers, Windows, Linux, right? All of those things you can manage. It is a cloud focused solution, right? That helps you bring the best of the Azure experience to all of the clouds where you might have a presence. And then a big one is innovation. I mentioned before that I can't recall a single thing that's gone into Configuration Manager that is specifically to manage servers. Now, you might think of orchestration groups. Yeah, that probably is more of a server-focused thing, but it's not only for servers. There's advantages for workstations there too, right? So I stand by the statement. I can't think of a single thing that was added just for managing servers, right? Might have missed something, but certainly nothing really, really big. The innovation I see happening ongoing with Azure Arc. In fact, whenever I've been in Azure Arc, just a couple of months I've been playing with it, I've definitely seen things added to that were not there whenever I first started looking at it. So definitely innovation is happening on the Azure Arc platform in an ongoing way. And then finally, so I mentioned this would be a short session, right? We're getting close to wrapping up. The scenarios. So we will deal with all of these. The next session we'll talk about servers. And then after that we'll hit, Kubernetes and talk about SQL Server and virtual machines and Azure Data Services and how all that works with Azure Arc, right? Um, so that really wraps up what I wanted to show you here. I want to give you a little bit of a preview, just a little bit, right? Not anything really in depth, but just to show you kind of where we're going with this. So this is the Azure portal. And if I want to look up things that are Azure Arc focused, I can easily do it in search. So if I want to search for servers, you'll see there's an Azure Arc option. We'll see that in the next session. If I want to look at Kubernetes, right, there's an Azure Arc option for Kubernetes. If I want to look at SQL, then there is an Azure Arc option. SQL, there is an Azure Arc option, I promise you, for SQL. There it is, SQL Server, Azure Arc, right, there it is. And so there's other things I could keep going. I'm really not going to keep going. But as we drill into the different components, I'll just go to servers really quick. Servers Azure Arc, you'll see that I have one. Why did that just error out? Don't know. Let's see. I'll try to refresh. If not, well, I ain't gonna worry about it then. We'll see this tomorrow, whenever we get into it. But I was going to show you that there is a server listed here. Let's try it. Let's try refreshing one more time. If it gives me grief, I won't worry about it. But yeah, it's still giving me grief. Not sure why. I know that the connection's healthy, so maybe an oddity right now with my network connection, not sure. But we'll see this server section in the servers focused Azure Arc session, which will come next in the list. So we will wrap it here for now, and then we will start digging into the specific technologies with Azure Arc later in future sessions. So we will end it and see you next time.